Guten Tag. My name is Craig Ebert, President of the Climate Action Reserve, and it's a real pleasure today to have some key international experts to discuss the issue around scaling international carbon credit markets to meet global demand. In anticipation of a significant increase in demand, we all know that these markets need to be scaled far beyond current levels of market supply. In this session, we're going to have the privilege of hearing from some of the key experts to discuss exactly how we achieve a much greater supply given the expected level of global demand. Let me take the opportunity now just to introduce our speakers today. If each of you could acknowledge yourselves visually when I call on you. First, let me introduce Chris Leeds, who's the Executive Director of Commodity Origination at Standard Chartered, where he's been since 2011. And he is in charge of commodity risk management services for the bank's clients across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He's currently a member of the operating team for the Task Force for Scaling of Voluntary Carbon Markets, which is chaired by SCB CEO Bill Winters with assistance from Mark Carney, Governor of the Bank of England. And he's also active in CLPC's Net Zero Task Force and SMI's Financial Services Task Force. At Standard Chartered, he's built up the bank's energy risk management platform, which provides services for state-owned and merchant refiners, oil producers, airlines, utilities, and shipping companies. We're also privileged to have Lambert Schneider, who's the research coordinator for international climate policy at the OCO Institute. Since 2001, he has been actively involved in international climate negotiations, including as a party delegate, co-facilitator, observer, and UNFCCC staff. His research focus is on greenhouse gas accounting and carbon markets. He is also a member of the executive board of the Clean Development Mechanism and has served as chair and vice chair previously. He's also been an associate at the Stockholm Environment Institute and led a team at the UNFCCC Secretariat, which supported the international climate negotiations and methodological work related to the CDM. Finally, last but certainly not least, is Kelly Kazir, who's a vice president for global climate at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she leads EDS work to promote ambitious and effective global climate action in multilateral forums, including the UN Framework on Climate Change, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the International Maritime Organization. She's also recently led the global effort on mobilizing voluntary carbon markets, which required her to deal with a lot of opinionated, strong-willed people around the world, including yours truly, which she handled adroitly and with aplomb. So without further ado, let's go into the questions. And again, thanks everyone for participating today. First question, and Chris, I'll pose this one to you. Estimates have the demand for voluntary carbon credits increasing by a factor of 15 or more by 2030, and by a factor of up to 100 by 2050. What are the key steps that need to happen to meet this demand increase?
Thanks, Craig, and thanks very much for having me here today. And I'm really enjoying being part of the conference and the program that you've got laid out. So look, I guess first of all, it's worth saying, there's a big issue, right? We've got to reduce a huge amount of carbon emissions very quickly. We need to get to net zero by 2050, and we need to be reducing carbon emissions by half by 2030. So that's less than 10 years away. So there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done, and it's important to stress that companies themselves need to make those carbon emissions reductions within their own value chains. But that isn't going to be enough, right? It's certainly not immediately, because there's a lot of areas where we're not going to be able to see those emissions reductions taking place today, in the steel sector, aviation, cement. So we need ways of getting money into emissions reductions projects that will actually support reductions elsewhere outside of the value chain. It could be nature, it could be certain renewable projects, certain other projects. It depends, and that's something that the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets is working on. So on the one hand, you really need that supply side being made as high quality as possible to make sure that any of the projects that people are funding and investing in actually do what they say they're going to do, which is to reduce, avoid, or even, of course, remove carbon dioxide. And that's something that I'm sure we'll talk about later on. but we really need to make these moves now. So it's really scaling the type of projects that we've got, the infrastructure around that, understanding how that all works, and making sure that that's clear and that the integrity is very, very strong there. But of course, I mean, your question was around demand, and actually the demand side is really key. We all know that there should be huge amounts of demand if we're trying to make these kinds of emissions reductions in the time scale that we're looking at. We would need an enormous amount of demand to come into, into the voluntary markets and others. But it needs it needs that assurance that basically that companies are going to, when they buy these credits, are actually going to be able to use them and get recognition for those investments that they're making. Now, there have been some question marks over whether that's actually something that companies should be doing, whether they should actually be using carbon credits to claim as offsets, to claim somehow that they've reduced emissions somewhere else. And I think that's obviously something that we need to look into, and we are looking into. But what's important is to make sure that money is going into these projects to make the carbon emissions reductions that wouldn't happen otherwise. And just remember that they wouldn't happen otherwise. And this is what's important about the market. So giving companies that assurance that they're not somehow going to be criticized for doing so, and in fact given recognition for doing something that is going to make a difference to the climate.
Great. Anyone else want to offer their opinion on that topic?
Yes, I would be glad to.
Oh, yeah, sorry, go ahead, Lambert.
Thanks, Kelly, and thanks, everybody. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting us. I agree very, very much with Chris on the issue of quality. I think the market currently really faces mixed quality of carbon credits. And so if the market should play a role in the future, we need to address that. I think that's the most urgent issue. There are different shades of gray, and we need better standards and more transparency on the quality of carbon credits. I think a second challenge is the Paris Agreement. We are now in a regime where all countries have targets. And so we need to address these challenges and the challenges associated with double claiming. And I think the third issue is we need more transparency, in particular also in how companies report emissions and how they report what they are doing in terms of reducing own emissions and what part of the emissions is offset with which exact carbon credits, etc. So we need also more transparency on that end. Lastly, maybe a comment. I would put a question mark to this 100 scale by 2050. Like, if you think about 2050, we will basically be net zero in most sectors. And the only sector which probably will have significant emissions still is agriculture and some areas where it's really not possible to abate. And so we will need the removals to have either net negative emissions or to compensate for those agricultural emissions. So the business model where you can continue to emitting fossil fuel emissions and offset these, that has a very limited time frame, I would say.
Great. Kelly, did you want to say anything, or?
No, I mean, I'll just agree with Lambert and Chris. They both made very good comments. The only two things I would add are that we also need to look at scaling through moving away from all project-based approaches towards jurisdictional based, broader approaches, sectoral jurisdictional based approaches. And I think we're going to get into this issue later, but I'll just touch on it now, which is we also need to understand what a legitimate claim is for companies between now and 2050, because I think Lambert's well highlighted where we need to be in 2050, net zero. The science is clear on that. And the question is, what role can carbon credits play in the coming decades?
For many of our audience who may not know exactly what you meant by the need to migrate from project-based crediting to jurisdictional, could you just expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, sorry. Right now, a lot of carbon credit projects are just that, they're projects. The size the scope of the reduction is limited, contained. If we expand that to work with governments, whether federal governments or state governments, and expand the scale of those, we address a lot of the quality issues potentially in the market, but we also scale up the potential supply.
Okay. Lambert, you mentioned a key issue around transparency, and one key factor for scaling markets is greater price transparency. What are some of the best approaches for accomplishing more price transparency? And I guess associated with that, is it important to encourage the development of a single market internationally, or could countries or regions establish their own rules to address other goals, for example, protecting local or regional companies from excessive competition with large multinational companies? Or is it sufficient to have common operating principles across different markets? Lambert, that was to you.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I'm glad to try to answer that. I think there will be different markets with different quality features and with different scopes of projects which are eligible, and so they will have different prices, and I think that's completely fine. I'm not sure we will ever have this one global market with a single price. I also think there's a difference between carbon credits and allowances. So if you have ETS allowances, they are really fully fungible because each allowance represents the same thing, a right to emit, right? But with carbon credits, it's a little bit different because behind each carbon credit, you have a specific project, and each project has very specific features. Some projects have more sustainable development co-benefits, other projects have a more questionable additionality, etc. Some have non-permanence risk. So each project is different, and you can create a market where you say, okay, if you fulfill these minimum bars, all these credits are eligible, but still as a buyer, you get a certain credit, and that's backed by a certain project with very individual features. And so I'm wondering how much buyers will buy in the idea that they buy carbon credits at an exchange and they don't know what exact credits they get. They know, okay, they may fulfill a certain minimum bar, but they don't know what projects they will actually be buying. And it could be quite justifiable that there are price differences between projects if they have different features. So I think it's important to differentiate here between compliance markets where a certain type of credit is eligible, and if you meet these eligible criteria, like under Kazir, the aviation scheme, you are in and you are qualified, and these are kind of fully fungible units. And the voluntary market where lots of buyers are interested in promoting specific projects, etc. And so there may be well-justified price differences.
So, can I come in there on that, Craig? Because I, to a certain extent, I disagree. Just because I think if we're going to scale the market, you do need to have a benchmark. I mean, it will be global by its very nature because the voluntary carbon market at the moment is a global market, and you're getting projects all over the world, and obviously the problem's a global one. And I think if we can develop a benchmark and a reference price off that benchmark, then I think it will help the market scale. It will bring that transparency that we're looking for, and it will really help the market to scale. Now, I understand where Lambert's coming from in terms of what he's saying about the projects, and I don't deny that. But I think part of it is also about going back to Kelly's point, what are corporates able to make claims on. And ultimately, at the moment, it is a carbon market, and we're looking to try and reduce carbon. Now, the co-benefits that you get with many of these projects are fantastic. You know, the related to water resources, to poverty, to the biosecurity, and all of these kinds of things that are absolutely of interest to corporate buyers, but the ton of CO2 is what's most important, and again, I think that can and also be dealt with at source. That we can use conversion factors to come up with a number that is actually appropriate for that project in terms of the tons of CO2 that it's actually going to remove or to reduce. So I think the more we can do that, the better. And then I think what people perhaps misunderstand from that is that then that helps by bringing that standardization and that benchmark in. That then helps people to be able to price off that reference. And so you could say, well, this is the standard carbon credit, but I want to buy these extra co-benefits. I want to buy SDGs 5, 6, and 7, or whatever it happens to be. And you can then use that as a reference price that will enable you to get a better understanding of the relative value of these credits, and I think that will help scale the market overall, and will help the projects that Lambert's referring to. I think it will actually support those projects. It won't undermine them. So that's kind of where I come from. We're both trying to do the same thing, but I think it's a slightly different approach.
Thank you. This issue's already been raised, but I think it's critical. There's already several existing carbon offset providers bringing credits to the market, and they differ in quality in a lot of ways. As we move forward to try to expand the size of the markets internationally and presumably lead to more integration, what steps are most critical to build on the expertise of these existing providers while also establishing appropriate standards for overall offset quality internationally? Anybody want to tackle that one?
Okay.
Again, I think that standardization helps there, because it enables everybody to be able to get that level playing field and benchmark off it, and so you can then determine who's providing good quality credits and who's not.
And how do you achieve that standardization? Is it specification of certain attributes internationally, or is it a minimum set of standards, or what's the best way to approach that?
Lambert, were you going to come in there? I don't want to interrupt you. I think there's some value in having a sort of standard of standards, because we do see that the standards apply things in different ways, although they do apply core principles. I think there's some value in looking across and comparing them relatively to one another. I also think that we have to look at the demand side and start to standardize or even regulate how the claims are made by companies. I mean, so part of all of this issue is like, what are people claiming? What are they using? What are companies putting out there in the world? And there is no structured or standardized way for companies to make that clear to their stakeholders and to the public.
Yeah, if I may also come in, I think I understand the idea of establishing a benchmark and trying to have some way of standardization. And I think it can be a way, but I think there will still be quite different qualities above that, because projects are so different. And if you think about likelihood of additionality, there are some projects which don't have other revenues than carbon credits, and the additionality is really clear. But there are also some gray areas, and there are some where the additionality is really questionable. And so my question is, where do you put the benchmark? And you can put it at a certain level, but then even above that level, you will have different likelihoods of additionality. Or take another example, the duration for how long carbon credits ensure non-permanence, right? For how long you need to ensure that the emission reductions are not reversed. That varies from 5 years to 100 years. So there's a huge difference between carbon crediting standards. And so if you set the benchmark at 40 years, still, I would say a credit which guarantees for 100 years that the forest will stay there has a much higher quality than the credit which guarantees this only for 40 years. And so I think what we need is kind of independent assessments of the quality of carbon credits. We are working on that with EDF. Other people are working on that. And I think that's really useful to bring more transparency to the market. And ultimately, hopefully, and I think probably we have the same objective, Chris, is that standards improve their own procedures and have more alignment and move towards a higher benchmark. Because I think currently there are good projects out there, but there are also really bad projects out there where you have very little assurance that there are real emission reductions. And so we need to have a higher standard, in my view.
I totally agree with that, and I think you've got to think about the transparency is so important, right? And it will force the standard setters and the verifiers to make sure that they're continually improving that. And I mean, to be fair to many of the standard setters, that's what's happened over the years. They've realised that their standards needs to be improved, and they've tightened them all the time, and that will continue. As things change, we've obviously seen over the last few years that grid-connected renewables, most people now realise that they're no longer additional. They don't really, they're not really going to be acceptable for voluntary markets and for becoming carbon credits. But that wasn't the case a few years ago. So things have changed, and things will change again as we learn more. I think your point about the longevity of forestry-based carbon credits, again, it's a good one, but I think you'll start to see more standards, more standardization, and potentially, as well, as I say, maybe you can look at it from a point of view of a conversion factor. A project that's only got a 5-year permanence is obviously going to be less, as you say, has less quality, but potentially less value than one that's got a 100-year permanence. And so maybe it's a 20th of the value of the one with a 100-year permanence. That could be one way of looking at the conversion. These are the kinds of things that I think people will start to look at more closely.
Chris, you mentioned at the outset that we basically need to have global emissions by 2030. And Kelly, you were mentioning the importance of having clear, high-quality standards for corporate claims. Both are excellent points. One of the issues I wanted to pose is that companies have demonstrated they're justifiably concerned about ongoing debate over the best practices to follow to reduce their corporate footprint. The rules keep evolving. Yet the fact of the matter is humanity's out of time to reach the 2030 targets or beyond. Here we are in 2021, and I'll pose it as a rhetorical question for now, but does anyone really think the world is on a pathway to meet those targets by 2030? Given the fact that we're out of time, how do we unleash mitigation now without excessive criticism of actions to date? For example, as long as companies are pursuing a good faith effort to reduce their corporate footprint, shouldn't they be positively recognized for doing so and not subject to ex post criticism that perhaps they could have done a better job? Isn't the ongoing debate about best corporate strategies to pursue actually negatively affecting investments in climate mitigation? Because companies need to worry about how, will they be criticized down the road for the good faith efforts made today? How do we avoid this situation? That's open to everyone.
I'll jump in there. I think you bring up a lot of good points. I think we've already covered some of them. So one of the main tools we need to provide companies with, and the public more generally, is an assurance of what's high quality. So, right now it's very difficult for companies to navigate the landscape of credits. And I think the kind of system that Lambert and Chris have been talking about would be very, very helpful for them. I also think the tension here is because there's a fear that companies offsetting their emissions using carbon credits are getting themselves some sort of, get out of jail free card, and that they don't intend to reduce their emissions across their supply chain, their direct emissions, but also their scope 3 emissions. And we need to be clear that it's a yes and moment, right? You need to reduce your own emissions, and you need to make the investments that are going to be transformational in your supply chain and outside of your supply chain. So finding that balance is going to be key, and some really clear guidance on how companies should be pursuing climate action in the next decades is going to be really important. I'm a little nervous about so yes, by 2050, by around mid-century, we need to be at net zero. We need to have reduced our emissions as far as possible and then address any residual emissions through removals. That does not mean everyone should be pursuing removals now. The bath is full, the tap is still on. We need to both pull the plug and turn off the tap. So we need to be investing right now in reductions and removals. And we need to use every tool in the box. But we need to make sure all of that is framed by a responsible path to net zero and by high quality. So it's a tough question and one that we need clear guidance on urgently.
To partly push back on it, maybe that's the wrong phrasing, Kelly. For those of us who worked with corporates over the years, there's a justifiable reluctance to spend any money until the pathway forward is clearly laid out. And the problem is that we don't have that luxury of time anymore. And it would be much better if companies started investing in reductions, both internally and externally, today. Don't wait anymore. And yes, we can continue the ongoing debate, but some of us have been involved in GHG accounting for 30 years now. And my concern is that we don't have the luxury to do another 10 years or however long it's going to take to have a clearly specified set of rules. So how do we create an environment where we encourage companies to move forward, perhaps realize down the road that maybe they didn't make the best investments possible, but you give them a thumbs up for doing the right thing, assuming they deserve that thumbs up, and then just fix the system as we move on. But in the meantime, we're hopefully unleashing a lot of investment that needed to happen yesterday rather than a couple of years from now.
Yeah, let me just be clear, then hand over to Chris and Lambert to answer this because it's a very nuanced question. But I think that there's every urgency. This is so amazingly urgent to address, and I think it's all the tools in the box. So companies need to both reduce their own emissions and invest, and they need to do it today.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it is, but it is really important that they do have those net zero commitments, because that really enables them to frame it, to be able to demonstrate that they're actually doing something, and they can show how. And if it is too difficult, it's not economically viable. There are very good reasons why they cannot reduce their emissions today. Then they can say, well, I'm doing something about it. I'm still making sure that I'm spending money I wouldn't have to spend otherwise. If I wasn't doing this money would not get spent, and it wouldn't be going to these projects. And this is going to actually make a difference somewhere in the world. It may not be in my value chain, but it's actually going to make a difference somewhere in the world. And that's what matters. As you say, we need to start doing that today. And to have this approach of being critical of companies that are doing that is not helpful. But I think the way that by having a net zero target, a credible net zero target with not just a target of 2050, but also some interim measures 5, 10, 15 years down the line, companies can show the stakeholders and civil societies that they are actually doing something, and they mean it, and they can show how they're on a path to net zero. But at the same time, they can actually then justify the spend that they're making over and above what they would have done otherwise into those good quality carbon projects. We still need to maintain that quality. We need to maintain the transparency of both what the development of the projects themselves and the corporate actions. But if they're doing that, then that's got to be a good thing for the planet, right?
Yeah, if I may, I think I agree very much, in particular on the issue that companies need to reduce their own emissions, and they should really only offset what they cannot reduce. So I think the right approach is really to have science-based targets, and then to only offset to zero what you cannot reduce. That's the first key issue. And I see often different business models. I think there are a number of fossil fuel companies who sell ecological gas or gasoline, and you buy 1 cent more, and then they offset. They claim that they offset the emissions, and I think that's the wrong model, because it suggests to the consumers, you can continue to drive your SUV. There's no issue. You just need to pay 1 cent more and your emissions are offset. But that will not bring the transformational change which we need in the sector. So I think carbon credits are used in different ways in the market, and some do not help us to get to net zero by 2050. But of course, if companies really invest in all they can reduce on their own and they change their business models to those which really work for the future, and then they offset their remaining emissions, that's a good thing. And if they don't always choose the best offset credit, it's a hard thing, as Kelly said, to do that. But I think it's also a responsibility for them to do due diligence. I recently came across a case where some old projects from Russia and Ukraine, joint implementation projects, were used in Germany by a company to sell ecological gas, basically. And if you do a little bit of due diligence, you would immediately know that these credits have no quality, right? And still this happens. So having this transparency on the quality of credits, but also some responsibility for the companies to do due diligence, I think is key.
I think that's true. I'd just be irresponsible if we didn't mention one last thing, Craig, and that's that we're not going to get to the science, to where the science says we need to get, or what's enshrined in the Paris Agreement voluntarily. We're going to need policy to get there as well. And one of the most important things that companies can do is support good climate policy.
Thank you. From the comments that have made, it seems like there's sort of a hierarchy of mitigation action that you're suggesting companies follow. First and foremost is the need to look at directly what emissions they're producing and lower their direct carbon footprint. That's, for most companies, that's scope 1 and scope 2. And then secondarily, consider investments beyond their fence line, i.e. in carbon credits, including nature-based solutions. That hierarchy makes sense. We don't need anybody thinking they can just buy their way out of the problem and go about business as usual. I wondered if this policy telling companies to look inward could have some unintended consequences. I'll give one example. For many companies, their carbon footprint is largely defined by their scope 2 emissions, that is, their use of electricity. That's roughly a third of emissions globally. There's no question we need to green electrical supplies around the world, but any company should be looking at its options for lowering its scope 2 footprint. But since for most companies that scope 2 is their major part of their internal corporate footprint, do we really need most companies internationally focusing on how to green the electrical grid when we already know that no or low carbon emitting technologies are cost effective in many markets? And there are already electric utilities and many other companies that are well equipped to change the generation mix. Might other areas for reducing emissions be overlooked if there's too much emphasis just on the electric sector? Throw that open for anyone to respond to.
I think one of the challenges is if you buy green electricity, it does not necessarily mean that an additional renewable energy plant is being constructed, right? So green electricity is a difficult concept. I mean, I buy myself green electricity, and I think it's better than not to do that. But the risk is that the overall electricity mix may not necessarily change as a result, depending whether the same company sells more black electricity instead to someone else. So there are difficulties, I would say, with addressing it in that way. But I know that some companies also build their own renewable energy plants to supply their own electricity demand, and I think that's a really good thing. I think that's exactly what they should do.
Yeah, I think you should be encouraging. The thing about this push is that if everybody is demanding from their electricity generator green energy, then their electricity generator is going to have to do something about that. Now, ultimately, I think that should be a price signal that they should see, and that they should be able to benefit from that green demand and be able to channel those funds into reducing their brown or black emissions and increasing their green energy production. But that's having that demand pull is important. It sends that right signal to companies. Again, I think it's great that there are companies out there who can pay for their own electricity and make the change, but not all companies can do that, and that's the same with carbon credits. So the whole reason we have carbon credits is because everybody can't just go out and invest directly into projects. Literally at that project level, the credit gives them it democratizes it and allows it to be spread across the across the value chain. Again, the same with renewable electricity, right? That's why you have the trading of RECs and other certificates to ensure that companies can demonstrate that the electricity that they are supplying is genuinely green. It's not just something that they've put on the bill.
Yeah, and I would just, Craig, you started with the mitigation hierarchy and said first reduce your own emissions, then invest in offsets. And I just want to push back a little bit that I don't think those are sequential actions. I think a company needs to understand what they can reduce today through internal action and what they're going to need to offset or source through another avenue, and reassess that frequently, and assess the kind of capital investments they're doing to make sure that they can reduce more over time. So for me, it's not sequential, but it's something that needs to be revised frequently. And then on the electricity thing, I think this is an area that's ripe for policy. So one of the most important things that companies can do is support good policy, because it is one of the first transformational changes we need to make if we're going to have any chance in the climate fight.
And it's the easiest one realistically at the moment, right? With the fact that we've got cost-effective solutions there.
And if I may make a provocative statement, building on what Kelly said, I think the voluntary market, the whole voluntary market, only exists because we have lack of good policy. And I see it as a bridge that companies and individuals need to take action because we don't have the policies which are necessary. But if we have very ambitious policies which really bring the target to net zero emissions and put all the incentives for the companies to do so, right, through emission trading systems, through whatever type of policies, then there would be very little space, I think, for the voluntary market. So for example, in Europe, we have a target now of minus 55% compared to 1990 for 2030. And I think there's very little space, and there are so many policy packages being implemented that there's very little space, only in some areas, to still implement any voluntary projects. I mean, next to the double claiming challenge this raises, but just from a potential, because lots of legislation already enforces emission reductions. And of course, the picture is different in other countries. But I would frame the whole voluntary market as kind of, we need to take action because policy doesn't take the necessary action.
Lambert, just to explore that idea. To explore that idea a little further, you were commenting about the aggressive EU targets and why that's minimizing the need for voluntary action. Isn't there a component of this, though, where, frankly, all of us coming from more industrialized countries also have an obligation to invest elsewhere around the globe, far beyond whatever our current level of emissions are, simply because historically we're responsible for a good share of the atmospheric loadings of greenhouse gases? And one way to get at that is to encourage investment in, at this point, I would argue, what would be voluntary actions, perhaps in other jurisdictions. But it's simply getting one's house in order doesn't address the historical inadequacies of different requirements across the globe, where industrialized countries do bear a greater responsibility for this problem, and many of the developing countries certainly need assistance with their targets. How do we address that potential imbalance?
Yeah, I think I didn't mean to say that companies in Europe should no longer offset their emissions or should not invest in the global south to reduce the emissions, which they really cannot avoid. I was referring to that in Europe, there's very little potential to implement offset projects. So to develop projects in Europe, right? Because policies already address a lot of the potential. And at some point, also most companies, thinking about the future, they will also have emissions which are close to zero because these policies are in place. Not yet, but in the future. But still, even then, they could take responsibility. And I think one way of taking this responsibility is no longer doing offsetting, a claim which is by its own a little bit problematic because you make a promise which is really difficult to hold, right? Given all the uncertainties around additionality, baselines, etc. But one way of thinking it is that you say, okay, you set an internal carbon price, you make a budget from your own emissions, and then you invest that money in emission reduction projects and climate action and transformative action. And so you take responsibility and you do something for the climate, but you do not necessarily make the claim of offsetting and carbon neutrality, etc. So I think there are different ways. So even if you're close to zero emissions, to take responsibility and help others reduce emissions. I understand that this carbon neutral products and neutrality, it's kind of a goal and it mobilizes money. But I think it's also it's a real big promise which you're making, that you are really offsetting these emissions to the atmosphere. So I think there are different ways of taking responsibility, and I find this way of saying, okay, I establish a budget for climate projects, and that's substantial, and I fund activities elsewhere without making the claim of offsetting. I find that interesting.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think the thing about offsetting is that it's an easy product to get across to people. The idea that I emit one and therefore I offset one and I'm now neutral. So it's a very easy concept to get across, but it is problematic for those reasons that Lambert's discussed. So, but how do you ensure that we do make companies continue to make those investments and that they're given the right signals to do that? Because the problem is that when we take those kinds of props away, then that demand does go. And we've seen it already where people are turning around and saying, well, I can't use avoidance or removal credits for a net zero target, so therefore I'm not going to buy any product credits that come from avoidance projects. And obviously that's a lot of forestry projects. So that suddenly then it can be counterproductive to what we're trying to do. So we need to think about different ways of creating that demand. So I think that's really important. But going to your back to your point about equity, I mean, the fact is that we know that we know what the cap is globally on carbon emissions. It's something like 570 gigatons between that we've got left to prevent catastrophic global warming. So the cap is already there. The issue is about how you actually share that cap out. That's what we've struggled with through the Kyoto Accords and through Paris. I think we're moving towards that, where countries will have their own effectively differentiated caps, but that again would ultimately lead to a reduction in the need for the so-called voluntary carbon markets. But I think it's if you turn it around the other way, it's great that the private sector is willing to create these markets in the policy vacuum. Whilst there is this lack of clarity around the way that we're going to tackle emissions on a global basis until the issues that we've got around the Paris Agreement and Article 6 are resolved, companies are going to go out and find a way to do it anyway, and that's what the voluntary market's all about.
Let me follow up on that point. I think that's pretty critical because I think we've heard throughout this conversation that good public policy will ultimately overcome a lot of the limitations we're dealing with, but if I could play devil's advocate for a moment, I've been in the space for nearly 35 years. The Kyoto Protocol didn't have the impact we hoped it would for a variety of reasons. Here it is 2021, 6 years after Paris Agreement was passed. We know that the commitments made there were insufficient to address the climate crisis, and there are a lot of efforts involved in enhancing ambition, but we still don't have an Article 6 rulebook. Do we have the luxury of waiting for good public policy? Is it just around the corner? Or in the interim, how do we unleash the investment needed to make a difference?
I don't think we can. I think Lambert presented it well. It's a bridge, right? I don't think we can wait. But I think not waiting and not supporting public policy are two different things. Like, it's, I don't think there's one perfect tool. I think we need everything. So we need to make sure that where policy is not in place, we're using that bridge. That's an important bridge. But as carbon market people, our aim collectively is to do ourselves out of a job. We need to be ensuring that we fill the demand for credits with really high quality credits that are going to have transformative change. And we need to make sure that companies and countries are doing more and more, ratcheting up their ambition over time. So we need it all.
Yeah, and I think in some instances, carbon markets can pave the way for that, or crediting approaches. Like what we saw in Europe, for example, is that we had regulations for N2O emissions from nitric acid production. And then companies came and said, well, we can go much beyond these regulations if you give us some credits. And so that happened. And so they reduced emissions much further. And then this emission source was included ultimately in the European emissions trading system. And so now it's completely capped and all companies in Europe abate these emissions. And so this is where we need to get, right? That public policy addresses the emissions. And then in some instances, it can help to identify mitigation potential to move there. But that should be the end game, or the end target, that we really address the emission sources through appropriate policies.
But also going back to Lambert's point on the how carbon markets can perhaps lead, and I think that's another area that we'd love to see, or I'd love to see more clarity around, is how companies can be incentivized to invest in new technologies and to put money into technologies that are untested, but we know could have a massive impact. Because of course we know that when you look at many of the sources of emissions, they are still very difficult to reduce. So we're going to need some technological breakthroughs, and of course you're going to need to see companies putting money there, but knowing that they're quite risky. If you'd done the same with solar and wind, 20, 30 years ago, would we have been able to get those technologies scaled up and down the cost curve a lot quicker? So can we do the same now?
There's been a great focus on quality in this discussion. What are some of the important pieces of any international architecture to establish the institutions or organizations that we need in order to scale carbon markets in a high quality manner? And more broadly, what role should be provided by the public sector versus the private sector? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, I think we're going to see quite a bit of quite a few policy announcements this week during Climate Action Week. So I think that's going to be interesting how that develops, and how the new policies that are put in place, obviously in the US. But we've heard this today that the UK is going to set a new target now for 2035 of 78% emissions reductions from 1990 levels. So, again, that's tightening things up. That's going to help. But at the same time, companies are out there looking to invest in one way or form through whatever markets are out there. So the support that can be given to those markets, the more support, the better. So within the voluntary carbon markets, we're trying to create create that standardization and create good governance around the markets to make sure that those carbon credits are what we say they are, that they have that high quality, and that they are trustworthy. So I think all those sorts of things that are going to go together with each other. The voluntary markets and the compliance markets, you cannot completely separate. Never have been able to. Never will be able to. Nor should we try. They are complementary. But it clearly, as Kelly and Lambert say, that that policy piece is incredibly important, and just create the right environment for these markets to thrive, and for private capital to do what it always does well, which is allocate capital to the right investments.
Yeah, and I would just say, there's no need to talk about these markets as separate. Carbon markets can be a great policy instrument as well as a great voluntary instrument, and sometimes the two intersect. So we've seen the intersection between carbon credits verified by what were classically voluntary standards in Corsia, in California. We're starting to see, similar systems emerge in Colombia, potentially in South Africa. There's no bright line between all of this. We need to make sure that we're doing as much as we can to reduce our emissions, and part of that is making sure that emission reductions are cost effective. And carbon markets can be one really important way to drive that. They also tend to provide a flexibility that makes creating the right policy more politically feasible. And I mean, Craig, I think you've already pointed out some of the difficulties we've had in pushing far enough, fast enough. So the more we can smooth the political pathway, the better as well. So this isn't an either or. This can all fit together and must for us to succeed.
I'm curious what pieces of the puzzle are missing internationally to make sure that we see high quality coming to market. Lambert, I know you've done a lot of work on the attributes surrounding a high quality credit, but creating that architecture, making it happen, is a work in progress. And I'm just wondering if you or anyone else have thoughts on what you would like to see, and to make sure that any company investing in a voluntary carbon credit, at a minimum, is investing in a high quality credit that's making a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, there are some topics we haven't touched upon, but if you think about high quality, of course, additionality, I think it's still a key consideration, robust quantification. I also think, and I wonder how we can trigger that, I really think that the voluntary market should not only invest in the most cost-effective options, but also in those which are most transformational, like the technology options which we need in the long run to bring down the cost, as Chris said. So I think that's a really important feature. Of course, you also want to ensure environmental and social safeguards. You may want to have co-benefits, etc. And non-permanence, how non-permanence is ensured, I think it's a critical issue. We talked about that already. And one thing, probably we can't address that in full in the remaining time, but of course, a big controversy is the whole double counting risks and the double claiming, because now all countries under the Paris Agreement, they have targets, right? And the emission reductions from the projects are claimed by both the countries and the voluntary carbon market buyers. And there's a big controversy about that, whether that's an environmental integrity risk or not. And we did some assessment, and my conclusion is it does not necessarily need to be environmental integrity risk. It really depends on scenarios and assumptions, what happens and for what the credit is bought, and how the host country reacts to the purchase, etc. But in some instances, it is an environmental integrity risk, right? And not in all at all. But we have this uncertainty. And I think, in my view, it's problematic if that is not addressed to make, again, this claim of carbon neutrality, right? Because there's uncertainty around that. So I think you can support projects for which this double counting or double claiming occurs, and they are really good projects, and it's worth supporting them and worth helping the countries thereby to achieve their NDCs. But saying you are sure that you are carbon neutral through that, in my view, is problematic. But there are lots of different views on this matter in the market, and but that's a key issue I think we need to address and resolve to have high quality.
And you may be right. Maybe we don't have time to go into it. We're going to do it anyway. You raise the issue of double counting. That's a critical objective to ensure environmental integrity. How do we really address double counting and make sure that we've got high quality credits coming to market? What architecture is needed? What steps would any of you like to see to avoid that double counting? Is it ultimately something, for example, that falls to the UNFCCC Secretariat to follow, or what's the best mechanism to avoid this problem?
Yeah. Look, I mean, I think that's obviously, the Article 6 rules would go an awful long way, but you've got to remember that it will, even if they got agreed this year, this November in COP26, it's unlikely that they're going to be implemented for quite some time after that. I mean, I think it's at least 2 years before you're realistically going to be able to attach them to any claims, to any carbon credits that are made, and not every country is going to be able to do that. So, I think we've got to be a little bit realistic about what they can do in the short term. Long term, absolutely. I mean, that's probably the way to go. But that's maybe 5-10 years down the line. I think one of the other things we could look at, though, is infrastructure. And I know that there are plans afoot to put in place so-called meta registries. So the idea of having a single global registry that all of the carbon credits from all the different standards can effectively be registered against. Therefore, there would be for every ton of carbon that's reduced or avoided or removed, there would be a single unique carbon credit that would be traceable through that meta registry. So that's one way that could also solve the issue, because if each credit is unique and a ton is a ton that's related to that particular project, then that would also help to resolve the issue.
Yeah, I'll just say, because I'm sure Lambert wants to speak to the claims piece, and Chris, I don't think you were talking about it in the context of the voluntary carbon market when you said maybe 5-10 years down the line. I just want to draw a clear line in the sand for compliance markets. It's very clear that we need to avoid double counting through corresponding adjustments. I think there's absolutely, and I think that's something that we can establish. We don't have to wait for the Article 6 rules to be finally agreed to understand how that should work. We can put that in place now, and we should be working with the countries that are transferring credits or internationally transferred mitigation outcomes to put in place what they need to put in place to be able to avoid double counting, because it's a real threat to environmental integrity. When it comes to voluntary carbon markets, the issue is a little more complex. We spent a year, as you know, Craig, really trying to deep dive into that issue. And we still have further, we need to look further. And I think a lot of people have tried to address the questions for the voluntary markets through that issue of claims. But Lambert, I know you were going to speak to that. So I'll just say there is a line in the sand for compliance markets.
Yeah, I see the practical challenges, but I also see that many countries are getting aware of this issue. And just to mention an example, Switzerland and Peru, they agreed one of the first bilateral Article 6 agreements. And that agreement includes an option to use credits in the voluntary market, which are backed by corresponding adjustments. And I think that allows companies to truly make carbon neutrality claims if other features have high quality. And otherwise, they can make other claims as well, like saying that they made a financial contribution, etc. So I think there are various ways of how to address this.
Well, thank you. I can't believe we're out of time already. Kelly, you just teased us with the issue of corresponding adjustments for the voluntary market. We'll have to have a separate session on that one. But I want to thank all of you for participating today. Very insightful perspectives on today's market conditions and where we need to go. On behalf of the Climate Action Reserve and all of us attending NACW, thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you, Craig.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Lambert.